Hi, everyone. Today we're going to talk about the readings we completed from the New Testament, specifically from the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now, the New Testament readings are different from anything else we study in this course. The reading is non-narrative. That is, there isn't a storyline or much direct interaction among characters. The content is beautifully written and provides numerous thought-provoking points to consider about moral behavior. But our course isn't focusing on the writing style of pieces, although it could, and discussions about what constitutes good moral values is really more appropriate for a course in philosophy or theology. But I thought it was important to read these selections because the New Testament has had such a great impact on Western culture. In fact, it could be argued that it has had more impact on our culture than any other piece of writing produced before or since. So we're going to focus on what experts can tell us about the origins of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and what we can tell about the purposes they were written to meet. Now, as I said when we studied Genesis, we are simply discussing what literary, historical, and archaeological experts state. I'm not saying in any way that they know more than your minister, church, or family does, or that what they say is right and what others have taught you is wrong. I respect everyone's religious beliefs, and I wouldn't in any way try to get you to change them. But for the purpose of this course, we're going to look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke from a purely academic perspective. You don't have to believe anything our sources say. It's just that what they say is what you're limited to working with if you discuss the New Testament in exam 2. Okay, with that caveat in mind, let's see what some experts can tell us about this very important piece of writing. The source of this presentation is John Gable et al., whom you might remember as a source for our discussion of the Old Testament. According to literary critics John Gable et al., before the invention of the printing press, Bibles were handwritten, and 5,350 manuscripts of the New Testament have been discovered. Of those, no two manuscripts are identical in wording, and none of the manuscripts are those that were written by the original authors. The New Testament, like the Old Testament, is an anthology. That is, it's a collection of writings by numerous authors, as opposed to a single book written by one author. But the New Testament focuses narrowly on one historical event, according to Gable et al. That event was the giving of a new covenant to replace the covenant with Abraham established in the Old Testament. As we recall from our study of Genesis, God's covenant with Abraham was that if Abraham would follow him, he would be given a land of milk and honey, and through his descendants all the people of the world would be blessed. Now, Christians believe that the new covenant fulfills that promise, and that Jesus was the descendant of Abraham that was the blessing for all the people of the world. Muslims, of course, believe that Muhammad represented the fulfillment of that promise, and the Jews believe that the fulfillment of that promise through a Messiah has yet to take place. The word canon means a selection of books that are accepted as genuine, and there are 4 Gospels in the New Testament canon: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. According to Gable et al., no one knows who brought these specific 4 books together, or why they were chosen to be part of the canon instead of other similar writings produced at roughly the same time. But the earliest records in which these 4 books were grouped together dates from sometime before the end of the 2nd century, Gable et al. State. Now, Gable et al. Tell us that while the 4 Gospels are fundamentally different in content, arrangement, emphasis, and purpose, 3 of them have much in common in the way they are related to each other in terms of text and production. Those 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are called the Synoptic Gospels. The book of John is classified and often studied separately. Let's talk a little bit about the authors and purposes of the Gospels. Now, according to Gable et al., it's clear that Matthew, Mark, and Luke were each written by a different author. Unlike Genesis, these books aren't unedited compilations of 3 or 4 writings. They were each written by a single person. But no one knows who the authors of Matthew, Mark, and Luke were. The early church attempted to link them directly or indirectly with the disciples that they're named after. But the dates of their first appearance puts them outside what would have been the lifespan of those 3 disciples of Jesus, and Gable et al. State that there is no evidence that there is any link at all between the Gospels and the disciples whose names they bear. Now, as Gable et al. Point out, since the authors of the Gospels are unknown, it's more productive to discuss their apparent purposes. There are 2 theories as to why the Gospels were written, and they aren't mutually exclusive, so both of them could have been factors. One theory holds that contemporaries of Jesus were dead, or soon would be, and there was a need to record what they had witnessed. Another theory holds that the new church needed documents to help convert others to Christianity. While we might not know for sure what the purposes of the Gospel writers were, it's clear from studying the text that they are not biographies of Jesus, Gable et al. State. Some sections of the Gospels, such as the birth story in Luke, do appear to be biographical. But there's too much information about Jesus' life that's left out for the Gospels to be biographies. There's virtually no information about his life between his birth and the teachings that he presented when he was in his 30s. And there's no information at all about his personal life or education, and no information on his family members. So Gable et al. State that the writers of the Gospels focused on the concept that Jesus was the Son of God, and nothing that didn't tie into that concept was included in the Gospels. Instead of being biographies, the Gospels represent different attempts to shape Jesus' career as a speaker and the meaning of what he said, Gable et al. Say. Let's look at the historical context for the Gospels. First, it's important to note that many people believe that the Gospels were written first and the early church sprang from those writings. But that isn't true, according to Gable et al. They state that the church had branches across the Mediterranean world before the earliest gospel was written. Now, before the Gospels, Jesus' teachings would have been passed around through oral tradition. And the writers probably would have used those oral teachings as a basis for their writings, Gable et al. Say. They also say that their writings most likely reflect a consensus of what was believed by each writer's local church. The unanimous opinion of modern biblical, literary, and archaeological scholars is that Mark was the first of the existing Gospels to be written, probably around 70 A.D. Luke and Matthew were the next 2 Gospels to be written, most likely between 80 and 90 A.D., although there is a great deal of uncertainty about the exact dates, and no one is sure which of those 2 was written first. And John was written later, probably shortly after 100 A.D. Okay, let's take a look at how the Synoptic Gospels connected to each other in terms of the composing process. There are several different theories of how the writers of Luke and Matthew used other texts as well as their own ideas to compose those Gospels. We're going to look at a theory that is called the two-source theory, which is detailed by Gable et al. Scholars believe that at least by the time that Matthew and Luke were written, there was a separate document that has never been found. They base this belief on the fact that there are portions of Matthew and Luke that relate the same material and stories, but that material and those stories aren't in Mark. So whenever scholars believe that there's a missing manuscript or document, it's called the Q document. The first of the existing Gospels to be written, as we've talked about, was Mark, which was written, as we've said, about 70 A.D. Now, scholars believe that the writer of Mark included information that he gathered from his own experiences with Christianity, and he didn't rely on the Q source at all. In fact, we have no idea whether the Q source was written before or after the book of Mark. We just know that the writers of Matthew and Luke include so much of the same material that's not in the book of Mark that there must have been a Q document. Of course, the writer of Matthew had his own material and approach that weren't presented in either Mark or Luke, and that material is represented on our chart by the red circle. And so he used his own information to produce the book of Matthew. And then he added information from the book of Mark, and he added information from the Q document. So all of that information, Matthew's own ideas and approaches, some text from Mark, and some information from the Q document, all went together to compose the book of Matthew. Similarly, the writer of Luke, who is represented by the green circle, also had his own ideas and approaches that contributed to writing the book of Luke. Then, in addition, that writer also took information from the book of Mark and from the Q document. So, the book of Mark, the Q document, and the writer's own ideas all went together to compose the book of Luke. But notice that the books of Matthew and Luke are not connected in any way. There's no indication that those writers had any contact with each other or knew that the other person was writing a gospel, according to Gable et al. Now, you might ask how this is different from making Genesis up of 4 separate writings. Well, there's a very significant difference. The Pharisees had put together the priestly version of Genesis, which was the final version in Hebrew. If we recall, they used the Yahwist, Elohist, and Deuteronomic texts without editing them or deciding which of the 2 or more versions of the story was correct. But Matthew and Luke chose selected portions of Mark and the Q text and then edited them to suit the purposes of the book that each man chose to write. Now, you know from taking comp classes that there's a big difference between copying an article word for word and taking information from several outside sources, putting it in your own words, and putting the information from different sources together in a way that support a statement you make, right? So, composing the books of the Bible was a lot more complex than that, but it's kind of the same idea. You can kind of think of the initial composing process for the book of Genesis as being like directly copying information from 2 or 3 web pages and tacking that information together in a document that you're going to send to a friend on some topic. But the initial composing process for Matthew and Luke is really kind of similar to writing a research paper. The writers of Matthew, Mark, and Luke relied on various literary genres to communicate their messages. Now, we recall that a genre is a classification of literature. Modern examples of genres include mystery, science fiction, romance, humor, westerns, horror, things along those lines. Okay, so let's spend a few minutes talking about the genres that we'll find in the full books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. First are the sayings of Jesus, and those are abundant in all 4 Gospels, which reflects the importance of Jesus' teachings, according to Gable et al. Some of these sayings are accompanied by stories of where Jesus is when he says them, how he gets to that location, or whom he is speaking to. But the point of the selection is the sayings themselves, not the stories. Pronouncement stories, on the other hand, feature pronouncements that are always in the context of a story, Gable et al. Say. But the story exists in order to lead up to the saying, which Jesus usually states at the end of the story. A good example of a pronouncement story that appears in Matthew, Mark, and Luke is the story about Jesus eating with taxpayers. When he's criticized by associating with people who, at that time, were considered corrupt and evil, he replies, "I came to call sinners, not the righteous." Now, that statement is the point of the story and the reason for including the story in the Gospels. Now, as the name states, miracle stories are the stories of Jesus' miracles. There's only one miracle story that appears in all four Gospels, and that's the story of Jesus feeding 5,000 people with only a few loaves and fish. Parables are also short stories that are told specifically to illustrate a point. But the difference between a pronouncement story and parables is that the story associated with the saying in a parable isn't expected to be taken as a story of an actual event, according to Gable et al. Parables are similar to fairy tales. The story of the tortoise and the hare, for example, demonstrates how strong but steady wins the race, but no one is expected to believe that there was ever an organized race between a turtle and a rabbit. Although some Gospels were written largely for Gentile, that is, non-Jewish readers, the authors were interested to a greater or lesser degree in tying Jesus' life and work to the Hebraic prophecies from the Old Testament, Gable et al. State. In fact, it appears that they went out of their way to search for Old Testament prophecies that they could tie to Jesus in some way. While these citations appear in all of the Gospels, they're particularly noticeable in Matthew because of the writer's audience and purpose, which we're going to talk about in a few moments. The accounts of events in Jesus' public career relate important events from Jesus' life that are connected to his career as a speaker, according to Gable et al. Examples include Jesus' baptism by John, his choosing of his disciples, his entry into Jerusalem, and his cleansing of the temple of people who profit by charging interest. Just as an aside, it's interesting to note that usury, which was defined at that time as making a profit by charging any interest at all, was the only sin that actually angered Jesus to the point of throwing tables, but is the basis of capitalism. Finally, there are the passion narratives, which are the stories surrounding the arrest, torture, and execution of Jesus, Gable et al. Say. Although no one knows who wrote the Book of Mark, it is believed to have been written by one person who was a Gentile writing to other Gentiles, according to Gable et al. Mark is believed to have been written about 70 A.D., a time that was marked by visible turmoil on earth, particularly the Jewish War of Rebellion against the Romans, which occurred from 66 to 73 A.D., Gable et al. State. Now, according to the Book of Mark, between the time that Jesus resurrects from the dead and the time he ascends into heaven, he promises that he will return. And Gable et al. Tell us that the writer of this gospel appears to believe that the turmoil was associated with his return and the final battle between good and evil. This belief is reflected in the apocalyptic discourse of the 13th chapter of Mark, as well as in the book's persistent ethical dualism, which is a philosophical approach that views the world as being split between good and evil and as an arena for the struggle between those forces. Because the writer believed that the end of the world was rapidly approaching, it was written with a sense of urgency, which is demonstrated by its strong language and abrupt narrative style, Gable et al. Say. The urgency with which the gospel was written left no time for a birth story or any extended discussions of Jesus' teachings. Now, according to Gable et al., the Book of Mark is characterized by rules for living a Christian life that are scattered throughout the Gospel. Now, while the rules lack a sense of coordination, they have two aspects in common. First, the rules are strict and absolute. Second, simply following those rules is not seen as a ticket to heaven. The gospel maintains that obeying rules and being good can take a person only so far, and that salvation is achieved by repenting sin and believing the gospel message, according to Gable et al. Let's take a look at the book of Luke. According to Gable et al., the writer of the book of Luke is believed to have been a well-educated Gentile with a cosmopolitan outlook, meaning an outlook that is at ease with many cultures. The writer wrote excellent Greek and adapted his style to a variety of situations, Gable et al. State. Now, while the book of Luke contrasts with the book of Mark in both style and content, the writer is believed to have adopted the writer of Mark's outline for Jesus' career and included about half of it, Gable et al. Tell us. He also added material from the Lost Q document that appears in Matthew but not in Mark, and, as we talked about, added material of his own. The material from the Q document and the writer's own material led to a gospel that modifies the sternness of the book of Mark. The gospel also differs from the book of Mark because the writer of the book of Luke was much more literary in his approach. The style is much more urbane, meaning that it's more refined in manner. According to Gable et al., the most striking characteristic of the writer's view is his philosophy of universalism. The content of the gospel indicates that the salvation from sin that was provided by Jesus' death and resurrection was intended from the very beginning to be for all mankind, not only the Jews. Okay, let's take a look at the book of Matthew. The writer of the book of Matthew is believed by many scholars to have been a Jew writing to other Jews. Like the book of Luke, the gospel revises and expands on the book of Mark by including material from the Lost Q document as well as the writer's own material, according to Gable et al. The book of Matthew presents Jesus as a Jewish prophet and teacher with authority derived from being the Son of God and a direct descendant of the Jewish King David, according to Gable et al. In fact, the first chapter of the book of Matthew traces Jesus' bloodline back to King David. Both Matthew and his audience believed in the authority of the Jewish scripture, Gable et al. Say. The gospel cites more Jewish prophecy than the other three gospels do, with more than 60 quotes from the Old Testament included or referred to. But despite the book's strong connections to Jewish scripture, the writer appears to be very bitter and unforgiving towards the Jewish people, Gable et al. State. The content of the book indicates the writer believes that the Jews missed their destined historic opportunity by rejecting Jesus and not accepting him as the Messiah promised in the Jewish scripture. Okay. I hope that provides you with a little background on what scholars say about Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now again, I want to emphasize that I am in no way saying that what these scholars believe is true, and what any religious organizations or personal beliefs indicate is not. This nation was founded on religious freedom, and I absolutely respect everyone's religious beliefs. You don't have to believe anything that's presented in this video. It's simply what you need to learn for the purposes of this course and what you need to use if you write about Matthew, Mark, and or Luke in your second exam. Now, of course, don't forget that if you have any questions about this video or anything in this course, all you have to do is email me from an account other than Canvas. Thanks so much for studying this video. We'll talk again soon.